Our guest today is Deborah Taylor Tate, who is a former commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission. But probably more importantly, Debbie, you're now the executive in residence at Lipscomb University. So welcome to Lipscomb.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean. It's great to be here.
Well, thanks. It's great to have you. Debbie, tell us what the Federal Communications Commission is. What does it do? It sounds really important. How do you get to be a commissioner? And what do commissioners do?
Sure. Well, it's really remarkable. I had a lot of interaction with the commission because I was originally the chairman of our State Utilities Commission. So, of course, knew a lot about what the FCC did, at least in terms of telecommunications, the regulation of companies like AT&T and the old Bell South. But it's really remarkable when I got there to see 2,000 employees spread out all over the entire country, bureaus including an international bureau, which we can talk more about, and spectrum issues, wireless bureau that obviously now, you know, has an enormous job in terms of the huge explosion of wireless industry and applications here in America. And actually what you realize is that the FCC touches every citizen basically from the time we get up in the morning till time we go to bed at night, actually 24/7 now. And then, of course, more recently, the FCC has, of course, become involved with getting broadband spread across the entire country. So it's just amazing how many times, you know, that we touch ordinary citizens. And that was really one of the wonderful things that I found when I got to Washington.
So you were a commissioner. Now, how many commissioners are there?
There are 5 commissioners. One
commissioners.
is a chairman,
Okay.
and the party of the president determines the majority of the commissioners. So
Okay.
right now there are 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. When I was there were 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats.
Okay,
So
all right.
it changes with the presidential.
Is this a full-time job?
Oh, yes. My husband would say it's about a 24-hour-a-day job.
More than a full-time job.
I don't think I ever turned off my BlackBerry the entire time
All right.
that I was there.
So you had an office in Washington, even though you
did.
maintain your residence here in Nashville.
I did.
And did you have a staff?
I did. Every commissioner has a staff. Actually, sadly, I tried to change the composition of the staff because they're kind of siloed according to communications. So we had a wireless advisor, a wireline advisor, but in this whole world of convergence, I was really interested in my whole staff really learning about each one of the other industries. So we tried to do that, but it's very hard to change an agency, of course, that's been around for decades.
Sure,
So.
and I can imagine that. Now, the term convergence is an interesting term because I think that begins to get at some of the things that I'd like to talk with you about this morning. The idea of convergence would be where all of these different forms of communications come together or converge, and we're seeing that happen in our lives as we speak. My phone, for example, has suddenly become my television.
Oh, absolutely.
Or,
and your movie theater.
or my browser.
Yes. Yes.
So talk with me about the future of communications from your expert perspective, having served on the FCC. What is the future of the internet, for example?
Well, you know, I think that no one really knows what the future is, and that's probably why I'm one of those regulators that says we need to have regulatory humility, and that is get out of the way and let's see where the market goes. We have lots of ways that consumers can be protected, and in fact, right now, there are probably about 7 or 8 nationwide providers of internet services, you know, along with VoIP, which is voice over internet, so you can now get telephone over the internet much more cheaply. Wireless providers also give you the opportunity to connect wirelessly, so you don't have to be tied to your computer at home or office, for instance, but you take it with you. And I think probably the best predictor, if I were the CEO of a company, I would be looking at what our kids are doing. And that is, they are demanding every product and every service with them wherever they are all the time. So I think that's where, you know, we're going to be headed for a long time. Now, that's not to say that we don't need to still worry about the 15% or so of Americans, you know, who don't have access to broadband. So that's one of the jobs that the FCC still needs to do, and that is to ensure that every American has access to broadband and the internet.
Let me ask the question just a slightly different way. I think we've all been amazed in the last couple of years as we've watched Apple revolutionize our lives. The Apple iPhone was more than just another kind of phone. It introduced the idea of apps, for example. Then the iPad came along, and now we've seen a proliferation of tablet computers, and we think that's probably going to revolutionize education in our world. So tell me what you think Steve Jobs is thinking about as he sits at his desk, drinks his cup of coffee, and his job is 2016. What is Steve Jobs thinking about?
Well, I bet $1 million he's not sitting at a desk. And in fact, when I went out to the Google campus, they have a rule at Google that if the CEO types, the Larry Pages and Sergeys, aren't in their office, somebody else can use it. And so literally you walk down the hallway, and actually it's all pretty open, but you look in what might be Larry Page's office, and there's some young, 22-year-old sitting in there.
In the CEO's office?
Yes, and it's because they are out all over the world. And that's part of what also is going on. We have to realize that now it is not just an American marketplace or a Western Hemisphere marketplace, connecting Canada and Mexico, our telecom systems, but it really is a global marketplace. In fact, interestingly, one of the things that I didn't ever think about going to the FCC was how much international travel and how much global cooperation that there has to be in order for all of these different new applications and technologies to work. Because even though they're all new, and even though it seems like it's wireless up there, somewhere in radio waves in the atmosphere, you also, for instance, have to connect through trunk lines and cable lines going under the ocean, for example, or up to satellites. So each of those takes so much cooperation, between entities like the FCC and other communications regulators around the world. But back to Steve Jobs. So, I think he's looking at what young people want. I think he's looking at what other countries are doing. For instance, when I was in Japan, Docomo, the largest wireless provider there, their cell phones do everything from checking your blood pressure to your heart rate, your body mass, your fat index. The latest one that they wanted me to try out was bad breath, and I declined that. But, they have moved in a direction that their cell phones are so healthcare oriented, which I think is just fantastic. I understand that now, our providers are moving in that direction as well. And I really, really applaud that. Yesterday I heard on CNN that you could hold your cell phone up and, listen to your heartbeat and your heart rate or whatever. So I'm really excited. But I think that there's so many applications out there that, whether it's Steve Jobs or any of the other entrepreneurs out there, that they're looking at what can we do, what are the next sectors to go into. You mentioned education, e-books. So why carry around 50 pounds of heavy textbooks when we're going to be able to just pull it up on an app or a tablet?
That's great. Well, that confirms my impressions as we've taken students around the world since I've been here as the dean, and particularly in places like China. We think we're very sophisticated in this country, and then you go to China and you realize that we're not really very sophisticated. China is way ahead of us in so many different ways. So looking at the globe now, from your perspective as a former U.S. FCC Commissioner, where you looked at the U.S. primarily from a regulatory standpoint, but you learned about the globe. Tell us what we look like around the world as users of the internet and as 21st century travelers along the global highway, the global internet highway.
Well, in some ways it's very interesting because we started with old technology, with wires and DSL and then cable, and so we've kind of moved through this whole transgression. Whereas you go to Africa, for example, and all they have are wireless technologies. And so it's funny how many of the third world countries have been able to just leapfrog over what took us years, and I have to say, billions of dollars of investment, you know, by infrastructure providers. So I don't want to take anything away. I'm so thrilled that we had those companies who wanted to invest, because we were the first, you know, to have the internet. And in fact, it's really unbelievable just to think about how quickly, when I see those old pictures of the old 5-pound phone, and now think about what we're able to do in just, you know, a credit card size technology, a device that has more computing technology than the original space shuttles. You know, it's just remarkable. So in some ways, we're having to now catch up because they were able to leapfrog because of our technological advances. And like I said, I think that our youth are going to drive all of this movement, you know, more and more to wireless.
And it's really interesting. Tom Friedman talks in his books about the proverbial fellow in a hut in Africa who has technology, internet technology, and is marketing what used to be crafts, but he's doing it on his website around the world from Africa, and he's competitive worldwide. And that's flattened the world and changed the world. So what advice would you give our students regarding the 21st century world that they're entering?
Well, I think one thing is to really be open to the world and to travel and to read, as you're saying, but to actually go there and see it, you know, because I think that, one, it really inspires you to see what a third world country, for instance, is doing. I remember seeing these farmers in China, you know, that are out in the middle of provinces far, far away from any cities, and they're checking the prices of commodities before they go to market. You know, and so it's just revolutionizing, you know, e-agriculture, for instance. So I think that all sectors are going to benefit from this incredible, you know, dynamic revolution that's going on. So I would just really encourage both you as the dean and your students to keep going out there around the world. And then also to invite those people here. You know, have them come so that many, many more of your students have an opportunity to hear from people around the world. And now, of course, with telecommunications, you know, global communications, you don't need to have them come. You can just do all this by Skype or, you know, by the internet. So I just think there's some absolutely unbelievable things yet to happen. You know, apps was one of those huge turning points. There'll be another one. So I hope it's one of your students or many of your students that are part of that.
Our guest today is Deborah Taylor Tate, who's a former commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission and now an executive in residence at Lipscomb University. Debbie, we've been reading in the newspaper a lot in recent weeks about the term net neutrality, and that becomes, I think, a bit of a confusing issue. So tell us what net neutrality is all about, and tell us why the rest of us ought to care about net neutrality.
Right. Well, every time that somebody brought the issue up to me in my office, I would stop them and say, okay, define what net neutrality is for me, because it's one of those really amorphous concepts like, you know, apple pie. It sounds great. But when you really get down to it, it really isn't neutral at all. It's really about the government becoming more involved in regulating the internet. And interestingly, this is one place where I think that we do need to be careful, because even in Europe, they've decided that there's so much competition that they don't want to regulate the internet. Recently in December, the majority of the FCC has decided to move more toward net neutrality and has adopted an order. It will be interesting. I'm sure the companies are all reading that order. It was huge, voluminous, to see exactly how it's going to affect them. But in a real world environment, I think that we want network operators to have their networks function well. You know, we've always had priorities in networks. If you were calling a 911 call, your call is prioritized. Voice has been prioritized over data. You know how it is when you turn on your computer and sometimes you get a whole series of emails all at one time. Well, that may have been because the network is trying to regulate itself so that the voice calls get through and then the data comes through. So we don't really care, you know, if we get a message a few minutes later than we might have. However, if there's a surgeon doing telesurgery, I want to make sure that his stream isn't cut into by a gamer, for instance. You know, one of the issues is that 5% of the people are using about 90% of the bandwidth. So in that way, I'd kind of like for them to have to pay for it. And so that's one of the things that will be interesting about this order. Are companies going to be able to say, okay, Dean, you're using an awful lot of the bandwidth in your neighborhood. So in order to keep using that amount, we're going to ask you to pay more. The grandmother down the street that looks at a few pictures, sends maybe 20 emails a week, you know, why should she pay the same as somebody that's using an enormous amount of bandwidth? So I think one of the things that we're probably going to see is some different pricing models, which, you know, I think is only fair, because somebody who doesn't use very much probably shouldn't be paying the same that I'm paying, you know, at least to do my business, and to use video in my business, and to use GoToMeeting or other, you know, heavy bandwidth type of applications. So it'll be interesting. Right now we're just at the point, as I said, where the FCC has adopted an order. We'll see. Sadly, they did that even though a majority of Congress had asked them not to take that step. So we'll see whether or not Congress passes something or it gets challenged in court.
Now, when you were on the FCC, I know one of your key issues was the protection of children.
Absolutely.
And you became interested in that, I think, on a global basis, not just on an American basis.
Right.
And I guess that would be a logical thing. You're a mom. I think you have three children. So talk to us about what created that interest, why that was important, and maybe what we should know about the issue of protection of children from a perspective of an FCC commissioner.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I first became involved because, of course, I started hearing from parents, you know, about what was going on. And originally, it's interesting, I'd been very involved in the issue of child obesity. 10 million kids in this country are obese or at risk of being obese, and part of it is because our kids are spending more and more time in front of screens. And so originally that was about television, how much time they were spending in front of TV, which was really pretty incredible. It's over 22 hours a week, more than they spend in school and more than they spend with their parents. So originally I'd really gotten involved in that piece. Then it became not just the screen time in front of television, but the screen time on a device, the screen time on a laptop, you know, and so I started then looking at what are children using this for? And of course, with all the e-learning and all these fantastic opportunities, you certainly want to continue, you know, the positive aspects of the internet. But I think we also have to look at some of the challenges. Now we're starting to see gaming addictions. Kids are dropping out of college, for instance, because they become so addicted to games. The violent nature of many of these games, the stalking that has occurred, the missing and exploited. The Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Washington came and talked with me and said, we would love to have you more involved in this issue, that kids are meeting people online and friending people who may not actually be their friends. And so it's just kind of a scary time. I think that a lot of us separated this virtual world from the real world, but really this is our kids' real world. And so now we're beginning to see the effects of cyberbullying, and sadly, as we've seen recently in the news, even suicides from cyberbullying. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is go out and talk to both parents, policymakers in Washington, legislators, and now farther out internationally about, if we're going to have this in schools, then we should have a curriculum that helps kids to be savvy users of the internet. And then, in addition to that, it's become a whole part of a larger cybersecurity initiative on the international level, because what's a great way for, for these cyber terrorists to get into our own networks, but through children who may not be very sophisticated. So.
You are now a public company director from your vast experience on the FCC and as an attorney. You've got the credibility to be named to a public company. I think you've recently been named to the board of HealthStream here in Nashville. which is a very fast-growing public company. We have the Hilton and Sally Dean Institute for Corporate Governance and Integrity here at Lipscomb, so we're very interested in good board governance. We're very interested in promoting diversity of boards,
Yes.
the perspective of women and minorities in addition to the traditional males who have largely occupied the board seats. Tell me about your role at HealthStream. Tell me about your view of the need for diversity on boards, and how can we perhaps help to promote more diversity on boards?
Sure. Well, I think it's important, first of all, that you all actually recognize this as part of a school curriculum, and this is something that is important to Lipscomb, I know. I came at this interestingly because the broadcasting industry had been so criticized for the lack of diversity in women and minority ownership of media companies. And so while I was out speaking about that, I also started doing a little research about how few women there were on all the Fortune 500 boards. And so I really became seen as a spokesperson for getting more women and minorities on boards. Very exciting, the SEC has now obviously started requiring a process of boards. So boards need to have a process, and then they don't just need to have a written process, they need to actually implement that process. So HealthStream is one of the boards that has a very active process, and I was very thrilled. I actually joined another new member who is a doctor, a physician at the Cleveland Clinic, who actually happens to be an African American. So they added both a female and an African American, which I'm really thrilled about in terms of HealthStream. And I hope to actually advance more of that with boards all over the country. Have become involved with, some associations and women's organizations, so that I can be out speaking about that now that I am on a public board. And I think one of the important things is just bringing a diversity of both background, opportunities, the ability to really look at an issue maybe before a board with a whole new way of thought or looking, and just to bring a broader perspective. So, and of course, I'm so excited about HealthStream because it brings so much of my background in working with getting broadband out there now in terms of real applications specifically regarding the healthcare field, educating nurses, for instance. And now we're really getting into many more of these using models and a program, so that rather than being a heavy cost to health providers, you can actually provide this online.
You mentioned earlier in the program cell phones being used in other parts of the world to monitor health care and to advance health care. And of course the digital use of healthcare records is a huge subject in this country right now, and perhaps our only hope to cope with the increasing cost of healthcare in this country is to figure out how to digitize a lot of the information and reduce cost. So tell us what we should be thinking about from that perspective.
Absolutely. Well, one of the really specific issues that I've been involved in is the fact that the entire mental health community was left out of the HITECH Act. So here we talk about all this parity between our health care, our physical health care, and our mental health care, and that we want to move toward an electronic medical record, and that we've left out a very important piece of all of us, and that is our mental health care, because we want to make sure that whether it's medications that don't work well together, as you well know, Turney, many people who have a heart attack or some kind of heart disease also suffer from depression. There are many of those drugs that do not work well together. So we need to make sure that both the person is healthy and that they're also not spending a lot of money on meds, for instance, that it's costing the overall health care budget, when those meds really both don't work well together and don't improve the patient's health. So I'm really specifically involved in that. It is so important that we move to that for pharmacology, for instance. As you know, there's a lot of abuse that goes on in terms of people going to multiple pharmacies. In Tennessee, under TennCare, we've really solved a lot of those problems, but there are many other states where that is a still huge drain on the cost of health care, because people are able to go to multiple pharmacies and get multiple prescriptions. you know, especially for very serious drugs.
Sure, sure.
So.
Debbie, I've been amazed as I've come back to Lipscomb and begun to teach, and now in my role as the dean, at how much the students value all of us as mentors. I didn't really anticipate that, but they do, and they see the life experiences that we've had as very valuable advice to them. So let's conclude our interview today by asking you what you would say to our students from your perspective of having lived at least a portion of a lifetime. I'm sure you're not near the end of it, but you've had a great deal of experiences, and particularly on a global level. Well, what advice would you give our students?
Well, I guess the first thing is just to be open. You know, to think about at 49 years old being appointed by the president to a job in Washington, D.C., when a lot of people are kind of winding down their careers.
Sure.
So be open to opportunities whenever they occur. Be involved. So that's whether it's at the university level, whether it's in your community, your state, your nation, or globally. But be involved. Give back. That is just so important. I used to always say, you know, your vocation should be your avocation, and your avocation your vocation. And I always have these little slips of paper that I paste up, and now I don't know what I'm going to do that we're moving to the mobile world, but you know, Micah 6:8 is do justice, show mercy, and walk humbly with God. And so I also try to bring my faith. That's one of the real reasons that I got involved about childhood obesity, about protection of children online, because I feel like no matter where you are, you should not just do a good job, but do good as you're doing a good job.
Thanks for coming to Lipscomb. Thanks for being with us today. It's been a great pleasure. I wish we had twice as much time. I could really enjoy hearing you talk about all of your experiences. Our guest today has been Deborah Taylor Tate, an attorney, a mom, a former FCC Commissioner, and now an executive in residence at Lipscomb University. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.